Angola, a land of stunning landscapes, a rich network of cultures and languages, and a wealth of natural resources. This should be one of the jewels in the crown of Southern Africa, a place of happiness, prosperity, and hope. And perhaps it will be. Perhaps the coming years, decades, centuries will be kind to this nation on Africa's southwest coast. After centuries of colonial exploitation and decades of brutal conflict, this nation and her people have undergone unimaginable hardships and suffering. They deserve their time of peace and dignity. Since the fracturing of European colonial systems in Africa in the middle of the last century, Angola has been a scene of almost unrelenting bloodshed. It's also a place where global superpowers pull strings, flick switches, and cast human life aside as they play games of ideological and geopolitical supremacy. The Angolan Civil War was a tragedy on an enormous scale, but it was also a focal point for Cold War posturing, leaving hundreds of thousands dead and millions more with no place to go. This is Untangling Africa, and this is the Angolan Civil War, when ideologies and ethnicities collide and civilian communities are torn apart. A coastal nation of seafarers and explorers perched on the western extreme of Europe, Portugal got a head start on its neighbours in the race for imperial power. Reaching the Congo Kingdom in what is now Angola as early as 1483, the Portuguese set about creating a colonial base in southwest Africa, exploiting its resources, dealing in slaves, and spreading their own brand of Christianity among the local population. Nearly 4.5 centuries later, and the Portuguese monarchy was finished. The Republic of Portugal was declared in 1910, and in 1926, the military seized power in a bloodless coup, paving the way for the fascist dictatorship of Antonio Salazar from 1932 onwards. But even after such wholesale change, the Portuguese were still in Angola. In fact, Angola was being pulled closer into Lisbon's orbit. By 1951, Angola was no longer a colony, instead transitioning to a province of Portugal itself. Those who thought this might herald a new era of equality between indigenous Angolans and their European Portuguese counterparts would have had their hopes quickly dashed. Forced labour, rampant exploitation, and the dilution of Angolan language, culture, and belief by mass migration from Europe pushed the region to the brink. But Angola was not isolated anymore. Centuries of maritime trade connected the land to the outside world. Money and commodities flowed back and forth across her ports and docks, and ideas did too. Ideas like African nationalism and decolonization. Ideas like Marxism and socialism. After 10 years of provincial status, the pressure cooker of Angola was ready to blow. Only 3 days into 1961, cotton plantation workers launched the Baixa de Cassange Revolt, a protest over their miserable working conditions. Identity cards were openly burned and Portuguese traders were assaulted on the plantation. The following day, Portuguese planes shattered the revolt, bombing villages indiscriminately and killing up to 7,000 people in a sickening display of power. In February, the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or the MPLA, formed only 5 years earlier, unsuccessfully attempted to spring some of its activists from an Angolan prison. In retaliation, settlers carried out their own raids on black Angolan neighborhoods, leaving countless dead in their wake. In March, another revolt broke out over forced plantation labor, and the colonial authorities hit back with more air raids in Baixa de Cassange and in the Icalo e Bengo region, while Portuguese ground forces moved in. Portuguese retaliation for the March revolt left some 20,000 natives dead. This might have caused outrage back home in Europe, but it didn't. As well as tens of thousands of African lives, the revolts had also claimed around 1,000 European lives. Some of these Europeans had been killed, often brutally and purposefully, some tortured and raped. It was this that caused the outrage back in Portugal. Public opinion was clear. The rebellion must be crushed. For more than a decade, bloody conflict ravaged Angola. The Union of Peoples of Angola, UPA, was one of the key belligerents, eventually merging with the Democratic Party of Angola, PDA, to form the National Liberation Front of Angola, FNLA. The MPLA also remained active, opening up a new front in the east of Angola. A third group, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, began their own campaigns in late 1966. As war spread across the country, it was often the local populations who suffered the most, as a diverse, complex, and centuries-old tribal network was shattered by the forces of modern ideology and weaponry. In 1968, the decades-long rule of Antonio Salazar was essentially at an end. A massive stroke put the dictator out of action, although he would live for another 2 years. The wheels of the Portuguese political machine were still turning though, and the fascist Estadio Novo limped on. The early 1970s brought new tactics from the colonial forces, reminiscent of those employed by the US in Vietnam, as napalm and defoliating agents sowed death and destruction in Angola, but still, they could not crush local resistance. In the end, it would be a domestic struggle that brought about the end of the empire. The Socialist Carnation Revolution of April 25, 1974 shifted Portuguese politics from right to left. The following year, Angola declared independence. On November 11, 1975, the new nation of Angola was officially born. After 13 years of bloodshed, the Angolans had prevailed, freeing themselves from the yoke of Portuguese colonialism with a little help from political discord in Lisbon. But what is an Angolan? Are the Ovimbundu the true Angolans, the descendants of the Bantu tribes who settled the central coastal regions over the last 1,000 years? Or is it the Ambundu, another group tracing its lineage back to the Bantu, speaking the Kimbundu language and settling in the northwest? Or how about the Bakongo? The Bakongo and the Ambundu were once aligned until the latter won its independence way back in the 1550s. And what about other tribes, cultures, and communities that call this place home? More than 1/5 of modern Angolans are in this collective of different groups. The answer is all of the above. Angola is a richly diverse nation, a multitudinous landscape of cultures, languages, and identities. The Portuguese never had to bother themselves too much with this. They dealt with the prevailing forces in the region and used military might and economic power to subjugate the land until they could not do so anymore. But in a newly independent, post-colonial African nation, it was different. If Angola was going to have a new voice for a new age, all would need to be represented. But the new Angola had a new kind of diversity too. Political and ideological disagreement had been a common theme throughout the War of Independence, as the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA vied to be the dominant force in Angolan nationalism. Now, without a common enemy, their attentions began to turn toward one another. The MPLA was a Marxist socialist organization initially linked to the Ambundu people in the northwest. The internationalist outlook of the communist movement meant the MPLA had some powerful friends, particularly the Soviet Union and Cuba, as well as East Germany and Yugoslavia. The Cubans even sent their own military personnel to fight alongside their Angolan allies. The FNLA adopted more of an African nationalist approach, initially devoting itself to the Bakongo and gaining the support of Mobutu Sese Seko in neighbouring Zaire in the process. With the Cold War in full swing, any enemy of communism was a de facto friend of the West, and the United States lent their support to the FNLA once fellow NATO member Portugal was out of the picture. UNITA, with its main base of support among the Ovimbundu, was left-leaning like the MPLA and nationalist like the FNLA, but could find little common ground with either. Following the Sino-Soviet split at the end of the 1950s, the People's Republic of China was keen to fight a Cold War of its own, backing UNITA in opposition to the Russians. This led to the adoption of Maoist principles within the group during the ensuing civil war. South Africa also supported UNITA with their own military units. The War of Independence had liberated the country of Angola, but it had broken it too. Tens of thousands of Angolans, many of them civilians, lay dead after only 12 months of fighting. By the time the Carnation Revolution rolled around, the death toll ran into the hundreds of thousands. But the leaders of a factionalized Angola were not finished with the bloodshed just yet. It was the MPLA that struck first, seizing control of the capital at Luanda in the wake of the Portuguese withdrawal. They declared independence and installed a new Angolan leader, President Agostinho Neto. The FNLA was not going to stand by and let this happen, and they launched an assault on the MPLA's Luanda base, their confidence buoyed by the fact that Mobutu and Zaire had backed their horse. It would not be enough. With Soviet support, thousands of Cuban troops and Yugoslav warships, the MPLA defeated the FNLA, potentially knocking one of the three key powers out of the conflict. But the FNLA was not quite done. UNITA were far weaker militarily than the MPLA, but they had the greatest popular support. In an effort to save their own skin and keep themselves in the fight, the FNLA's leaders established a second capital with UNITA at Huambo, and sent out pleas to South Africa to help them overcome Soviet and MPLA control in the region. South Africa heeded the call, but by the mid-1970s, the country's apartheid regime was isolated on the international stage, and what assistance they could provide would be limited. The MPLA understood this, and they seized their chance. As international units and advisors drained out of the country, only the Cubans and the South Africans remained. Soon, it would only be the Cubans, as they made the weight of numbers and the power of the Comintern tell in their operations against isolated South African troops. By 1977, the MPLA had achieved almost complete control, establishing a Marxist-Leninist government and stacking another piece upon the teetering seesaw of international Cold War politics. Not all members of the MPLA welcomed the party's new political identity. Nito Alves, a high-ranking party member with huge support, demanded Neto align Angola more closely with the Soviets. Neto, accusing his opponent of destabilizing party unity, held a vote. Alves and his supporters, known as Nitistas, were dismissed. On the night of May 27, 1977, soldiers loyal to Alves launched an audacious raid on Sao Paulo prison, freeing 150 Natista prisoners. Next, they took control of the radio station, announcing the coup that was taking place to the people of Angola. From here, they swept through Luanda, kidnapping generals and officials and commandeering the presidential palace, although Neto was not there. But the government's forces had already begun their counter-offensive. As it dawned on them that the coup was about to fail, the Natistas took their fury out on their prisoners, murdering 6 government and military officials before Cuban units restored government control. In the weeks that followed, the MPLA exacted bloody revenge on supporters of Alves, or simply those they suspected of being supporters. Around 2,000 of the suspected Natistas were murdered during this act of retribution. At some time during this carnage, somewhere, no one is quite sure, Nito Alves himself was captured and killed. His coup attempt was unsuccessful, and he paid the ultimate price. Neto died in 1979, and Jose Eduardo dos Santos took over as president of Angola. After 2 years of Marxist-Leninist rule, the country's economy was struggling, kept alive primarily by its oil production and its international support from nations within Moscow's sphere of influence. While MPLA solidified its power, the FNLA was fading away. The UNITA, on the other hand, was growing stronger, becoming the main opponent of Dos Santos's Luanda-based government. South Africa, perhaps still smarting from their defeats in the 70s, or maybe just worried about the prospect of a Soviet bloc power in southwestern Africa, got back on the offensive in a big way, supporting their allies in the UNITA. The South African Defence Force raided Cunene province in the south of Angola on May 12, 1980, and then again in Cuando-Cubango province on May 21st. The MPLA was enraged, levelling accusations of atrocities against UNITA and South Africa and threatening a robust response. South Africa was unmoved, and on June 7th, they made an astonishing move. Attacking through Namibia, South African forces launched a double-pronged assault, knocking out the Southwest Africa People's Organization, or SWAPO command center in the north of the country, and then carrying on with the full-scale invasion of Cunene and Cuando-Cubango. UNITA, along with South Africa, now had real swaths of territory in the south of Angola. The international community was outraged, but few nations took any meaningful action. The exceptions were Cuba, who sent yet more troops across the Atlantic to Angola, bolstering their ranks to 40,000 by 1985, and Zaire, who reinforced their support for the MPLA. On the international stage, outrage does not last long. By 1985, the USA, displeased by the ongoing existence of a Marxist-Leninist state in Africa's southwest, stepped up things a gear, providing military aid to UNITA for the first time. Meanwhile, the MPLA had rebranded, becoming the MPLA-PT, the Partido Trabalhista or Labour Party, and by 1987 they were back on the offensive. A war that was now 12 years old was about to step up in intensity once again. 2 years on, and the two invaded provinces were still in rebel hands. The MPLA now had their own formal armed forces, the FAPLA, and retaking these provinces had become top priority. So far, they'd had no luck. Throughout 1986, attempts were made to push the South Africans out of the country and to wipe out UNITA forces at Cuanda Kubanga and Cunene. Now in August 1987, the FAPLA was preparing to throw everything at their enemies and bring Cuanda Kubanga back under MPLA control for good. 8 brigades would advance on 2 fronts, pushing the rebels back to Mavinga while driving insurgents out of Moxico province to the east. If all went to plan, the next objective would be Jumba and the UNITA headquarters. But all did not go to plan, and what followed would be the biggest battle on African soil since El Alamein. For UNITA, the objective was survival. For the South Africans, it was to assist their UNITA allies and prevent the SWAPO from gaining a foothold in the south of Angola. For both, losing valuable ground to the FAPLA was unthinkable. As the FAPLA troops advanced on the town of Ceuta Cuanaval, a key objective on the way to Mavinga, the South African Defence Forces came out to stop them. The SADF units hit FAPLA hard. They'd been humiliated the previous decade, but that wasn't going to happen again. This time, it was the government forces and their Cuban allies who would turn tail and run, leaving thousands of their comrades dead on the battlefield behind them. Skirmishes around the area continued into 1988, and both sides claimed some form of victory. Ultimately, it was UNITA and South Africa who won the day, achieving their own objectives while the MPLA missed out on most of theirs. What was supposed to be an ultimate assault on rebel positions in the south had failed, and the rebels had earned themselves a seat at the negotiating table. In 1988, delegations from Cuba, from the MPLA, and from South Africa met in New York to agree on a deal. Watching South Africa and Cuba at the table, US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Chester Croker reportedly said, was like watching 2 scorpions in a bottle. Despite the obvious animosity, both the Cubans and the South Africans were eager to achieve a mutually acceptable climb down from conflict. Cuba had lost a huge number of its soldiers in Angola, while South Africa was alarmed by the rising stakes of the situation. The accords were signed on December 22nd, and Cuba withdrew its forces the following January. South Africa had already withdrawn from Angola and would withdraw too from Namibia under the terms of the agreement. Namibia would gain total independence from South Africa the following year. By June of 1989, Dos Santos and his UNITA counterpart, Jonas Savimbi, would themselves get around the table and attempt to thresh out a ceasefire deal. An agreement was reached, but quickly fell apart. The war might have lost its international aspects, but the civil conflict was still far from over. The 1990s ushered in a new world. East Germany had rejoined with the West. The Soviet Union disintegrated. South African apartheid drew toward its close. And yet a conflict that had been a key proxy in the now thawing Cold War still lingered on in this new decade. By 1991, both sides were weary, and at a Portuguese-mediated conference in Lisbon, both Dos Santos and Savimbi signed the Bicesse Accords to bring this bitter and devastating war to an end. The 1992 elections that followed could have been a new dawn for Angola, but the vote was split. While the MPLA claimed almost half of the ballots, no side achieved the 50% mandate. A second round of elections was called, and UNITA, proclaiming their suspicion over free and fair practices, sent their vice president, Jeremiah Chitunda, to Luanda in an attempt to stop what they believed was MPLA manipulation. But before the second round of voting could begin, chaos erupted in Luanda. MPLA forces and their supporters launched a devastating assault on UNITA positions. Local police began moving from house to house in search of UNITA voters, while civilians, freshly armed by MPLA units in the city, began murdering those suspected of UNITA sympathies. The traditional cultural divisions between the two factions gave the violence a racial aspect, and the dead were predominantly members of the Omvembundu and Bakongo ethnic groups. In what would become dubbed as the Halloween Massacre, as many as 30,000 people lost their lives, including a number of leading UNITA officials. Chitunda himself would be carjacked in Luanda on November 2nd. He and his UNITA colleague Elias Salupeto Peña were dragged from their car and summarily executed by the roadside. After the aborted elections, the already horrifying violence managed to find another gear. It's estimated that those killed 18 months following the 1992 elections numbered roughly half of all those killed in the previous 16 years of war. Cities fell under siege, shells struck military positions and civilian communities indiscriminately, and both sides committed atrocity after atrocity. In 1994, the Lusaka Protocol sought to affirm the Bicesse Accords and bring an end to the suffering, but Savimbi refused to attend personally, and the resulting ceasefire soon fell through. An enormous UN peacekeeping mission, costing over 1.5 billion, attempted to enforce the protocol, but bloody skirmishes and horrendous acts of violence remained common throughout the 90s. But with international support now non-existent and the Cold War now a fading memory, how were UNITA able to afford such a drawn-out conflict? One of the many disturbing aspects of the war was the trade in blood diamonds, precious stones mined in areas controlled by UNITA and sold on legitimate international markets to whoever could afford them. The British firm, De Beers, signed a contract in 1990 enabling them to handle diamonds mined in Angola and pumping billions of dollars into the country in the process. Even when international sanctions bit down, UNITA was still able to generate huge profits from illicit diamond trading. Between 1992 and 1998, UNITA made at least 3.92 billion from these trades, giving them almost unlimited coffers with which to prosecute a seemingly endless war. Even unlimited funds cannot defeat death. On February 22, 2002, Jonas Savimbi was killed at the hands of government troops during an engagement on Moxico. His successor, Antonio Dembo, had been wounded along with Savimbi and led the faction for only 12 days before his death on March 3rd. With Paulo Lukamba Gato now in charge of UNITA, and with the focal point of opposition now dead, the Angolan government softened their approach. Representatives of the MPLA and UNITA met in Kasamba and a ceasefire was agreed. A memorandum of understanding was followed on April 4th, and the decades-long conflict came to an end. Both UNITA and the MPLA remain to this day as two of the main political parties in a democratic Angola. But this is far from the only legacy of this devastating conflict. 1/3 of Angolans, some 4.28 million people, were displaced during the bloodshed. In 2003, it was estimated that 80% of Angolans did not have access to basic medical care, and 60% had no access to water. Child mortality rates went through the roof, life expectancy plummeted to less than 40 years, and 100,000 children were torn apart from their families. The material of war still litters the landscape. Between 2018 and 2021 alone, 156 people died in explosions caused by landmines and other ordnance left over from the Civil War, with countless more injured. Those fortunate enough to survive are left to fend for themselves with no support from the government. What began as a cry for dignity and self-determination in the face of colonial exploitation quickly morphed into a hell that would last for almost half a century. Millions of Angolans lived and died during this period of conflict, knowing nothing other than war for their entire lives. Communities turned on one another along ideological and racial lines, and now must live together, side by side, in a new Angola. It's more than 20 years since the end of the Angolan Civil War, but the scars are still visible upon this country, upon her land, and, most distressingly, upon her people. What do you think? How can Angola heal the scars of this horrific chapter in their history and look forward to something better? Let us know what you think in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.